Welcome, 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 everybody. I'll just give everybody a minute to join in. I'm Dareth Morrissey, and I'm on the board of the American Cetacean Society of Orange County, and I'm joined by another fellow amazing board member, Kendra Leek, and our distinguished speaker of the evening, Caroline Cappello. I wanted to let you know we've got a lot of people here that are watching that usually aren't part of our ACS group because usually we specialize in whales. And so I would, encourage you to follow us on American Cetacean Society Orange County.org to see all of our events that we have coming up in our speaker series. Next month, we have a special beluga event, November 16th, I believe, and it's going to be with Sue Steinert, the director of the Beluga Whale Alliance, looking at the critically endangered belugas of the Cook Inlet, and also Kim, who is a wildlife researcher that is working with belugas and Inuit populations in Canadian waters and in the Arctic. So that's going to be really exciting. And then in January of next year, we have Dr. Deborah Giles, who runs Wild Orca and had her dog, Eba, the wonder dog, who is a whale poop smelling dog that could detect feces from killer whales and humpbacks and minkies and grays, talking about monitoring the health of the endangered southern resident killer whales. And then we have a narwhal and polar bear expert from the University of Washington talking about climate change and Arctic mammals. So there are good things to come and learn about. And of course, all of our webinars are recorded, so you could always view them later if you happen to be busy on Thursday nights. So to introduce, and then we do have a naturals class starting. So if you're local in the area, classes meet at Orange Coast Community College, and it is Thursdays starting January 4th through March 14th. And it's a full encompassing program learning about our local marine mammal species and pinnipeds and geology and all sorts of great things, birds. So you can be a trained naturalist and go out on boats and educate our local population about all the wonders that we see off the California coast. So Dr. Caroline Cappello is a wildlife researcher and biologist that specializes in ecology and conservation of penguins. And I was fortunate enough to see her talk at the Aquarium of the Pacific last year. And even though it's not a whale, it was so amazing that I asked her to be one of our guest speakers, and she agreed. So she is currently working out of the University of Arizona. And I don't want to take any more time away from you. So if you have anything to add, please, and we are going to turn this over to you. Probably unmute.
Yeah. For the mute button. Wow, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you out there who are tuning in on a weeknight, and thank you to ACS for inviting me to speak. I'm really excited to share with you a little bit about what I know about penguins, which are near and dear to my heart. And I've been studying them for the last 9 years. So I'm excited to share some of what I've learned. Yeah, okay. So before I begin today, I really want to emphasize that this work I'm sharing is highly collaborative. I did this work with the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels at the University of Washington, which is led by Dr. Dee Boersma, and I continue to collaborate with colleagues there on ongoing projects. We also have incredible collaborators in Argentina and in Ecuador, particularly within Galápagos National Park and within the provincial government of Chubut in Argentina. And we really couldn't do any of this work without them. We also couldn't do this work without generous donors, both large and small. These projects that I'm going to be talking about tonight are long-term projects, some of which span over 50 years. So it really takes a village in terms of funding, and it really couldn't be possible without support from family foundations, from NGOs, and from individual donors. So if I were to walk into a room and ask everyone to close their eyes and picture a penguin, where is it? What are its surroundings like? What is the climate? I think a lot of people would come up with an image that looks something like this. It's penguins huddled on ice together somewhere in a cold place. They're standing near snow. This looks like Antarctica. And a quick Google search in preparing for this talk definitely confirmed that for me. I just typed the word penguin into Google and took a screenshot of the top 3 rows. And yeah, you can see there's a lot of white in these pictures, right? There's a lot of snow, there's ice, a lot of penguins that look like emperor penguins or king penguins. But there are 18 species of penguin on the planet, and they're actually pretty broadly distributed across the Southern Hemisphere. So if you ever find yourself in a temperate forest along the coasts of New Zealand, you may find yourself face to face with a tawaki or Fiordland penguin. If you find yourself in Melbourne, Australia, you could come across these two little blue penguins standing on rocks and seemingly taking in the city lights. On a hot summer day, you may be in Cape Town, South Africa, and head to the beach and find yourself amongst a colony of African penguins. And if you ever find yourself on islands off the coast of Chile, you may find yourself looking at a Humboldt penguin standing, on a cactus. So this is just to illustrate that penguins live in many places around the world, and they're really adapted to a variety of environments. And the two types of penguins that I specialize in, the Magellanic penguin and the Galápagos penguin, are two species that I think fall into this category of the sort of unexpected penguin or the lesser known penguin. They don't live on ice, they don't live in Antarctica. And so my goals today are really just to introduce you to these two birds, tell you a little bit about where they live and how they make a living. I'll then give you a brief overview of the types of research questions I ask about these birds and the types of questions my colleagues ask. And a recurring theme that will come up throughout this talk is the importance of long-term studies and the opportunities provided by studying a population across decades. And last, I'll try to touch on some of the conservation efforts that are ongoing for these birds. I'll touch on some of the challenges in conserving these penguins and also some of the opportunities. And before I begin, I wanted to highlight another reason why scientists are so eager to study penguins. And that is because penguins serve as a really excellent indicator of ecosystem functioning and ocean health. So this is important because we know our planet is changing, we know our oceans are changing, but it can be really challenging for us, being the land-loving apes that we are, it can be really hard for us to understand what's happening at sea, which is where we look for species like penguins that are accessible to us on land. They're measurable by us on land, but they can tell us a lot about what's happening in the ocean. So penguins spend a lot of their lives at sea. That's where their food is, so that's where they forage, that's where they migrate, they socialize, and they spend their winter. But they have to return to land each year to lay their eggs, and they frequently do this at the same time and the same place year after year after year. And so that predictability of when and where they'll be on land makes it relatively easy for a researcher to access them. And by studying them on land, we can learn about what's happening in the water. So if penguins are returning to land really skinny, we know there's something going on with their food supply. Or if they return coated in oil or with plastic in their stomachs, we know we have an issue with marine pollution. And so through these observations, we can increase not only our understanding of the ecology of our changing world, but we can hopefully plan conservation measures that will protect not only penguins, but entire ocean ecosystems. And so a lot of my work with penguins really thinks of them through this lens, where we ask not only what does our research tell us about penguins, but what do penguins tell us about the environment? So the first penguin that I'll talk about today is the Magellanic penguin. This is a South American seabird that breeds along the coasts of Chile and Argentina. Let's see if I can turn on my laser pointer. So they breed along the coasts of Chile and Argentina and spends its non-breeding time off the coasts of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and up into southern Brazil. Today, I'll be talking about a specific colony called Punta Tombo, which is on the Atlantic coast of Argentina. And Punta Tombo is a windy, dry coastal environment that's characterized by low drought-tolerant vegetation like pampas grass and low-lying bushes with lots of spiky, spiny spines. The Magellanic penguin shares this space with a lot of other really cool wildlife, which includes the elephant seal and sea lions along the coast, guanacos, which are a relative of the llama, and lots of small mammals like armadillos, skunks, foxes, and wildcats. And then there's a bunch of terrestrial birds at Punta Tombo that range in size from as small as wrens and sparrows, going all the way up to this rhea on the right here, which is a relative of the ostrich. You can see this penguin in the corner here is very suspiciously eyeing that rhea walking by. And there's also a host of seabirds other than penguins that breed at Punta Tombo, such as cormorants and gulls and terns. So each year, about 200,000 pairs of penguins return to Punta Tombo to breed. They'll lay one clutch of 2 eggs, and you can see the size of the eggs here compared to a Sharpie pen. They'll lay these eggs either in burrows that they dig into the soil or underneath some of those spiky, spiny bushes. And by laying their eggs underground or under bushes, that protects them from bad weather and also from predators like gulls that would otherwise fly overhead and potentially see and eat an exposed egg or an exposed chick. So here you can see a busy hill of penguins standing outside of their burrows. They're going to and from the ocean. They're bringing food back for their chicks. And we know a lot about this colony because the Boersma Lab at UW has been studying it since 1982. And almost every year since 1982, students and staff and researchers and volunteers have lived in the penguin colony for 5 to 7 months of the year throughout the breeding season. And they follow the lives of these individual penguins. So over the course of the study, our team has banded over 60,000 individual penguins with stainless steel bands that rests on their upper flipper. We've also collected over 1.5 million rows of data following penguin reproductive success, their movements at sea, their food, their behavior, and a lot more. And this data set is pretty rare in terms of how long-term it is and how detailed it is. And so scientists in our lab and our collaborators can use these data to ask a lot of different questions, ranging from looking at genetic material to understand aging in penguins, scaling up to multinational conservation questions. I was fortunate enough to live in the penguin colony for 6 to 12 weeks every year from 2014 to 2018, during which time I measured and weighed penguins. I dove headfirst into many of these bushes looking for eggs and chicks. And we're not in person, so I can't show you, but I definitely got a few bites in the process and have some nice penguin scars on my hands. So yeah, during this time, I contributed to this long-term data set, and I also developed the questions for my research. And something that we know that is happening at Punta Tombo is that the colony is in decline. It's declined by over 40% since the 1980s. And so where it was once considered the largest colony of Magellanic penguins on the planet, as of a couple years ago, it no longer has that ranking. There's a colony to the north that's now larger. And we don't know exactly why this is happening at Punta Tombo. Part of the answer could be that penguins are actually just moving to other colonies that are now closer to good food sources. It could be that survival over the winter is low due to competition with fisheries or due to adults and juveniles getting caught in fishing nets. And it could also be in part due to changes that are happening at the colony that impact chick and juvenile survival. And these changes at the colony are something that I became very interested in over the last few years. And I became especially interested in looking at changes in the timing of important life cycle events for penguins, events like breeding and migration. And at Punta Tombo, we've observed that arrival to the colony from spring migration has delayed over the last 40 years. And egg laying dates are about 9 days later than they were in the 1980s. Our lab has linked this delay to unfavorable oceanographic conditions in their winter range that likely make it harder for them to find food. It then takes them longer to bulk up and sort of get ready to breed. That delays their the start of their migration back to the colony, subsequently delays their arrival and egg laying. And knowing all this, I was really interested in trying to identify what the consequences of that shift towards later breeding are. So it's possible that this shift is a good thing for the penguins, that by changing their breeding behavior, they can track environmental change, and that will enable them to persist and hopefully thrive in the wild. But it could also have negative effects that reduce chick survival or juvenile survival. So I've asked this question, what are the consequences of shifts in timing, a number of ways, and I just wanted to share a couple highlights from this work. So first, we looked to hatching dates of penguins. So we were wondering if those were also getting later. We knew egg laying was delayed. We wanted to know if hatching dates were doing the same. And what we found was that hatching dates did delay over the course of the study by about 10 days, which tracks really closely with that delay in egg laying that we already knew existed. We then looked at fledging dates, which for Magellanic penguins, fledging is the day that a chick leaves its nest and goes to the sea for the first time. And at that point, it's completely independent from its parents. It doesn't receive any more meals. It doesn't receive any more protection. And when we looked at those fledging dates over time, we did not find the same trend. And that really surprised us. And it meant that with the hatching dates getting later, but the fledging dates staying the same, that nestling period, or the number of days that the chicks were in their nest, growing, receiving meals from their parents, receiving protection from their parents, though that number of days decreased by over 14%. And those later hatching chicks were fledging significantly younger than their peers by 6 or 7 or 8 days. So we immediately had some predictions as to what would be the costs of fledging younger, or trade-offs associated with fledging younger. We predicted that chicks would fledge smaller because they hadn't spent as much time in their nest growing. We thought that they might fledge skinnier because they've received fewer of those last big sort of energy-giving meals from their parents. And so to test these predictions, we looked at a group of over 500 chicks where we knew their age and their size when they fledged. And what we found was that the younger fledglings fledged with smaller bills, both in terms of how long their bills were and how deep, or how the height of their bill. So both in terms of length and depth, those bills were smaller. And we think that bill size is probably pretty important for penguins when they're foraging, because their bills are basically a set of tweezers that they use to pluck fish out of the water. That's how they hunt. And so if you have a smaller bill, you may not be able to catch fish that are as large. And in general, there may be less prey, or less variety of prey that are available to you, because you can't hunt for those larger fish. So because of this potential risk of having a smaller bill, we then looked to see what the survival of smaller fledglings was after they left the nest, and as they attempt to survive that first really perilous year at sea. And we did find that those smaller chicks were less likely to survive and return to the colony as juveniles or an adult in later years. And so for us, this was a really interesting case of sort of cascading effects, where you had an environmental change in their winter range that led to a behavioral change in their breeding range. But that change towards later egg laying and hatching did not trickle through the entire season. There was a point in the year at fledging where that delay stopped. And when taken all together, that meant that the nestling duration decreased, and those younger fledglings left the colony with smaller bills. And in turn, the smaller fledglings were less likely to return to the colony. So this is just sort of a piece of the puzzle when talking about changes at Punta Tombo. None of what I'm presenting tonight is the smoking gun for why the colony has declined so much, but our team is sort of just chipping away at all these pieces, trying to understand or put together a complete picture of what's happening at Punta Tombo. The delay in breeding is not the only climate-related impact that we're concerned about at the colony. With climate change, extreme weather events like heat waves and large rainstorms are predicted to become more common. This is something we're experiencing on the West Coast of the United States as well. And we've already seen the devastating effects of extreme heat waves at Punta Tombo. In 2019, graduate student Katie Holt and Dee Boersma documented an unprecedented heat event at Punta Tombo, where during the day in the shade, the temperature got up to over 111 degrees Fahrenheit. And over the course of those few days, over 250 adults died from heat stress, and over 60 chicks died as well. And this was not something that we had ever seen in the colony in the 40 years that our project has been working there. On the flip side, we're also concerned about rain. Rainstorms can be pretty problematic for chicks because small chicks, or chicks before they fledge, haven't grown in waterproof feathers yet. They just have their fuzzy chick down. And when they get wet, it's kind of like when a human, when we're wearing a down coat outside and we get rained on, that down coat stops keeping us warm. And so this is what happens to penguin chicks when they're exposed to rain at a young age. They can become hypothermic and they can die. And with rainstorms becoming more common, researchers Dee Boersma and Ginger Rebstock found that chicks were more vulnerable to death by these rainstorms. And they also found that these deaths by rain are additive in the colony. So these are deaths that are happening in addition to predation and in addition to starvation. And so these are things that we're worried about. And they're also examples of changes happening at the colony that we wouldn't be able to pick up on or observe if it hadn't been for this long-term study. We wouldn't know that the timing of breeding has shifted. And without boots on the ground in the colony, it would have been really easy for us to miss these extreme weather events like the heat wave in 2019. And these things can feel pretty heavy at times, especially knowing that there's not much our team can do day to day in the short term to alter the trajectory of global climate change. So this is where we start to look for other actions that we can take, other problems that we can solve for these birds that can give them just a little boost in survival or a little boost in reproductive success that can help them so that we help them as much as we can as they face this changing environment. And so I wanted to share a story today that predates my time with the project, but I think is a really inspiring story and really motivates me in my work as a conservation biologist. So in the early 1980s and 1990s, it was known that oil pollution was a problem for penguins and other seabirds along the coast of Argentina. Every year, hundreds of seabirds and penguins would be found dead on the shore, coated in oil. And this wasn't from a single catastrophic oil spill, not like the BP spill or the Valdez oil spill. This was from low levels of chronic oil pollution that were being discharged from oil tankers as they transited the coast and brought petroleum to ports. And in 1994, researcher Patricia Gandini and colleagues estimated that each year between 1982 and 1991, on the Argentine coast alone, over 40,000 Magellanic penguins were killed by oil pollution, which is astounding. And it was something that was documented by scientists. It was documented by veterinarians at rehabilitation centers, and it became a real object of public interest. Journalists picked it up, and people became very upset and really demanded a change. And at the same time, there were national NGOs and conservation organizations in the country that were working to develop recommendations to provide to the government to help fix this problem. And eventually, there's enough political will to act, and the government used the recommendations to make a change. And so in 1994, the provincial government of Chubut, which is where Punta Tombo is located, that government passed a law moving tanker lanes 40 kilometers further offshore. So I'll show that here on this map. It's a little bit fuzzy, but these two lines show where the tankers were. So the blue line here shows where the tanker lanes were in 1995, and the red line shows where they were passing in the year 2000. And what this did was not stop oil pollution, but it reduced the spatial overlap between where the penguins and other seabirds were foraging and spending a lot of time and where the oil tankers were moving. And so each year at Punta Tombo, since the government made that change, our team has gone out to survey the beaches and look for oiled birds. And about every 5 years, Dee Boersma and Esteban Frere hike and drive miles and miles all the way along the Chubut coast, doing the same thing, looking for oiled birds. And the outcome of this change is pretty exciting. I myself have never seen an oiled bird at Punta Tombo ever. And as of March 2022, when Dee and Esteban went out and surveyed the full Chubut coast, they also found 0 oiled seabirds. And so this is I think, really amazing example of there being scientists there to observe and document a problem, public will for change, NGOs having built the connections and relationships with the government that enable them to provide recommendations, and then the government taking action. And this certainly doesn't mean that oil pollution isn't a problem elsewhere in the world. It's still a threat for seabirds. But to me, this is a really amazing example of actions that humans can take to make a drastic difference for wildlife. And the long-term nature of the Magellanic Penguin Project has ensured that we not only were there to document a problem, but we were also able to follow up and determine the outcome of that management change 10, 20 plus years later. So that's something that really inspires me. And again, it's these not small actions, but smaller actions that we can take to really make a difference. Okay, so for the second part of the talk, I'm going to switch gear and bring us from the Atlantic Ocean over to the Pacific Ocean and talk about another sort of unexpected or kind of unusual penguin, which is the Galapagos penguin. These penguins are the northernmost penguin on the planet. Then they're the only species that breed north of the equator. They just barely reach up into the northern hemisphere. And they live in the Galápagos Islands, which are a volcanic archipelago about 500 miles off the coast of continental South America, and they are a province of the country of Ecuador. These islands are made up of active and inactive volcanoes. So on any given trip, you might have the privilege of seeing a volcanic eruption from a safe distance. This photo on the top left here is a photo I took in 2018 of Sierra Negra erupting on Isabella Island. And these eruptions create the foundation of the island. So walking around, you can see these massive lava fields, like this one on the top right here, that span just miles and miles and miles. And also dotting the coast of these islands are smaller islets, like the ones pictured on the bottom left here. These smaller islets are made of old tough lava. And so they're really dynamic. They're often changing shape and crumbling back into the sea. But they also make really excellent habitat for penguins and other seabirds. And these islands aren't totally barren. They're not without vegetation. They are home to many plant species, including grasses, cacti, and several species of mangrove. Galapagos is also home to a really rich diversity of fauna. It has high levels of endemism, which means there are animals here that only exist in Galapagos. And that includes the Galapagos sea lion and Galapagos fur seal. It includes the marine iguana, which is pictured here. This iguana is the only living lizard that spends time in the marine environment. So they swim out to sea, they dive below the water, and they scrape algae off the rocks with their teeth for their food. They're very cool. They can be also quite big. Galapagos is also home to several species of finch, which are collectively referred to as Darwin's finches due to their part in inspiring Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. And then there's also wildlife in Galapagos that are not endemic to the islands. They do exist elsewhere, but are pretty emblematic of Galapagos. And that includes these blue-footed boobies on the bottom right. So you may be asking why these volcanic islands in the middle of the ocean have such high biodiversity. And the answer is much like in California, it really lies in the surrounding ocean currents. And there's one current in particular that I wanted to mention, and that's the Cromwell Current, which is a cold water current that's really nutrient rich. And it sweeps across the Pacific Ocean from Asia and Oceania over into South America, and it pretty much hits Galapagos straight on. And so, as I said, this is cold water. It's very nutrient rich, but it's about 300 feet below the surface of the water as it's moving across the equator. But what happens when it hits Galapagos is that the topography of the islands shoves the water up, it pushes that cold nutrient water up into the surface where it now is in the same zone where sunlight can reach. And so that mixture of nutrients and sunlight allows for really productive growth of phytoplankton and algal blooms that form the base of the marine food chain and allows for all these wildlife to thrive in the islands. And of course, that that includes the star of our show today, which is the Galapagos penguin. These birds are endemic to Galapagos, so they only live on this one volcanic archipelago. And they're also resident to the islands, which means they're there year round. They don't migrate like the Magellanic penguins do. These penguins are listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List due to their small population. The last estimates estimated that there may be between 1,547 individuals total in the whole population. They have a restricted geographic range, being only in Galapagos, and they face ongoing threats such as mismanagement of fisheries, predation by introduced mammals like cats and rats and dogs, and the big one being the increasing frequency of severe El Niños. So El Niño, La Niña are probably terms that you're familiar with or have heard before. These are climatic events that alter weather patterns worldwide, including here on the west coast of the US. But the climate of Galapagos is particularly strongly linked to El Niño, La Niña cycles. And during an El Niño, the waters surrounding Galapagos, which is shown here by the yellow star, those waters become very warm and nutrient poor, and there's very little food available for marine animals. And during El Niños, it's common for there to be reproductive failure among sea lions, marine iguanas, and seabirds. And during really severe El Niños, there can be mass mortality of adults that don't get enough food. So this photo was taken on a trip that I took to Galapagos in 2016 during an El Niño. And during the trip, a lot of the penguins were looking like this. They were skinny, their feathers were brown and brittle, and they were coated in a layer of algae that to us indicated that the penguins were spending a lot of time in the water looking for food. And they were spending less time hauled out on land, drying their feathers in the sun, cleaning their feathers, and kind of keeping them in good condition. The current population of Galapagos penguins is thought to be about half of what it was in the 1970s, and that is thought to be due to mass die-offs associated with strong El Niños during the 1980s, 1970s, and 1990s. And because these events are predicted to become more frequent with climate change, Galapagos penguins are considered to be among the penguin species most at risk for extinction. And so the goal of our research in Galapagos is really to provide information to Galapagos National Park and other policymakers that will enable them to effectively manage and protect this population, as well as other marine predators. So some of our research goals specifically are to estimate the survival rates of Galapagos penguins. What is the likelihood that an individual survives from one year to the next? What is the probability of survival if it's an El Niño? What if it's a La Niña when food conditions are really good? We also want to determine chick survival rates by checking penguin nests. We want to determine penguin body condition by weighing and measuring them, and that enables us to determine, are they skinny, are they fat? And that gives us some information about the food supply in Galapagos. We want to identify emerging threats quickly so that we can act to mitigate those threats if we can. And we want to test different management actions that we can take to protect penguins. We want to know what Galapagos National Park and others can do now and what they can do in the future. So to do this, in 2010, Dee Boersma began a new project studying Galapagos penguins, working with our primary Galapagos collaborator, Godfrey Merlin, and with members of Galapagos National Park. And I joined this project in 2015. And every 6 months, we've traveled to Galapagos and lived aboard this research vessel named Ratty. And each trip, we buzz along the coast looking for penguins, searching for nests, and trying to capture as many penguins as we can so that we can get information on their body condition, and also so that we can tag them. And we tag them with small stainless steel tags in the webbing between their toes. And that is what enables us to estimate survival. So if we come back on another trip and find the same bird with the same tag, we know it's still alive. But this is not always a very easy thing to do. As I mentioned earlier, these birds are rare. There may be as few as 1,500 total, so they can be hard to find. They're really dispersed across their breeding range. They don't nest in dense colonies like a lot of other penguins or seabirds. And instead, they're sort of spread across the coast and are tucked underground in nests that are inside of lava tubes and tunnels and crevices in the rocks that make them really difficult for us to find. So when we're looking for them from the boat, they can be really invisible to us when they're inside their nests. And they also live in remote, uninhabited places. Our first study site takes between 25 to 30 hours to reach by boat. So the logistics of these trips are really challenging, and the penguins don't usually help us out too much. But to give you a picture of what this does look like once we've reached our study sites, on a nice day like this, we'll hop in our wooden dinghy and we'll boat along the shore looking for dots on the rocks that seem like they could be penguins. And if it looks like we can approach those rocks, we'll hop on the shore, we'll try to catch the bird if we can, so that we can measure it and weigh it, tag it and release it. And we'll also search the area around the penguin to see if there's a nest nearby. A lot of the time, however, our trips look more like this, where we have a pair of penguins high up on some rocks here, and we're sitting there in our dinghy, watching this big swell come in and then drop rapidly. We're looking at how slippery those rocks are. We're looking at how many sharp barnacles are all over them. And it's just really not looking good for us to be able to land. So in a case like this, we'll count the penguins, we'll make a note if they're an adult or a juvenile based on their feathers, and then we'll move on. We won't search for a nest or try to capture them. But if we do find ourselves in a position where we think we can capture a penguin, like in this video, the water is calm, the wind is calm, everything's in our favor, there's a big group of penguins on the rock, so we're moving in with a stainless steel hook that we use to catch them. And you'll notice here now we are stuck on a rock. We've hit something right below the surface of the water. The penguins took one look at us and said, I don't think so. And they've jumped into the water and they're swimming away. And we can no longer catch them. So this is just to illustrate that it's pretty challenging to catch these penguins. We'll really bust our butts down there for a couple of weeks each trip, and usually catch between 30 to 60 penguins, which is generally enough penguins to estimate their body condition, estimate their survival, but we certainly know that it's very likely that on any given trip, there are birds out there with tags on that are still alive that we just don't see. So that's where we turn to quantitative tools and turn to models back at the lab in Seattle to try to estimate survival of male and female Galapagos penguins, given that we don't perfectly detect every bird. So this figure is from an analysis that we did last year that shows their survival from 2011 through 2022. And this is the survival probability here on the y-axis. And what I wanted to point out here was this dip in 2016. That dip in survival corresponds with the 2015-2016 El Nino that I referenced earlier, where all the penguins were looking like this. And so we were able to see that signal of the El Nino in this model impacting not only reproductive success, like we saw on the islands when there were no active nests during those trips, but we can also see that it may be impacting adult survival as well. And so just like with the Magellanic penguins, we find ourselves in Galapagos in a position where there's not a lot our team can do in the near term to change the trajectory of global climate change, to stop the increasing frequency of El Niños. So again, we look for other ways to help the population in the near to medium term. We look for ways to help boost their survival, to boost their reproductive success, to help them as they face this changing world. And one of the things that we do know is an ongoing problem in the islands is introduced predators. We know that there are rats and cats and dogs on the islands that eat penguin eggs, they eat chicks, and they can even kill penguin adults. And so this likely limits the area in the islands that the penguins can use to nest safely, because there's just kind of too many predators around. We also know that some of the best penguin habitat that is still predator-free is eroding. And that's a natural process. Those rocks are just sort of crumbling back into the sea. But both of these things together likely limits the available good nesting habitat for penguins. And that lack of nesting sites did seem like a problem we could try to solve in the near term with human action. We can try to increase opportunities for penguins to breed by giving them more nests. So in 2010, our project, in collaboration with Burr Henneman and with Galápagos National Park, built 120 semi-artificial nests out of natural materials in 4 sites on the islands. And we did this either by excavating lava into a lava tunnel or tube, or by stacking lava rocks into these penguin houses, like you can see on the bottom right here. And in building these nests, we hoped to test one, whether penguins would use constructed nests. We wanted to know if they would continue to use them after their first attempt. We wanted to know how long these nests would last, what types of nests the penguins prefer. So basically, we're trying to figure out if this can be a cost-effective management solution for Galápagos National Park. And the ultimate goal of these nests, if they do work, is to make sure that when food conditions are good in the islands and the penguins are fat and healthy and ready to breed, that they all have a shady, protected area to lay their eggs and raise their chicks. So we built these in 2010, and every 6 months, the project has returned to the islands to check every natural nest that we know of, to search for new natural nests, and to also check these constructed nests. And the sort of quick and dirty results from this project are that, yes, the penguins will use these nests. We have seen pairs acting territorial inside these nests. We've seen penguins incubating eggs. We've seen them brooding tiny chicks like this one here. We've also seen penguins move into these nests as little as 6 months after we built them. So we'll build a nest one trip and come back the next trip, and there's a penguin inside. So that tells us the penguins are potentially actively looking for new nesting sites. And we've also seen penguins use the same nests over and over. So this nest on the bottom right here is our most popular nest. Basically, every time we go, there's a new layer of guano caked around the entrance. There's often a bird inside, or birds acting territorial. And so this has been a really exciting conservation success. It seems like this potentially could be a good tool for Galápagos National Park moving forward. But you may also be noticing that these rocks and nests look kind of similar. They're all that kind of like red lava rock. And that's because all these nests are at the same site. As I mentioned before, we built them in 4 different locations, but they've only used them at this one site. And so at first we thought, okay, they're just not interested in the other sites, or they haven't found the new nests. Until 2021, when we came back for the first time after the COVID shutdown, and we found a pair of penguins inside an artificial nest at Punta Espinosa, which is a new nest site, or a different island altogether where a constructed nest was in use. And when we returned in February 2022, that same pair was inside the same nest, and it was now incubating eggs. And there were several other nests in the area that also had penguin guano inside, or penguin nesting material like sticks and grass. So in this case, it took the penguins almost 10 years to start using these nests. But because we kept checking them, we were able to observe that they did eventually use them. So in total, 21 of the constructed nests have been used a total of 47 times. And that constitutes 28% of all active nests that we have found since 2011. And so these numbers may look kind of small, but for a rare and endangered species, we're really excited about these results, and we feel really encouraged that this could be a viable management solution for Galápagos National Park long term. So our next steps for the project are to answer the question of what types of nests the penguins prefer. So we've been measuring the opening of these nests, measuring how deep the nests are. We've also been measuring the temperature inside the nests using these data loggers. And in doing this, we hope to be able to hone in on what is the preferred nest and the best nest for us to build, so that the penguins are most likely to move in and successfully use them. So as we continue our project in Galápagos, we'll continue to work towards estimating survival. We'll continue checking these nests and trying to determine reproductive success. And in doing so, we hope to provide information to Galápagos National Park that will help them to help penguins thrive. And I wanted to end tonight with a quote about shifting baselines. This is a concept that I think a lot about, particularly in my work in Galapagos. And it's a concept that was first talked about by fisheries scientists in 1995, Daniel Pauly. He said, and I'll just sort of read you this quote. He said, "This shifting baseline syndrome has arisen because each generation of fisheries scientists accept as a baseline the stock size and species composition that occurred at the beginning of their careers and uses this to evaluate changes. When the next generation starts its career, the stocks have further declined, but it is the stocks at that time that serve as a new baseline. The result, obviously, is a gradual shift of the baseline, a gradual accommodation of the creeping disappearance of resource species and inappropriate reference points for evaluating economic losses resulting from overfishing or for identifying targets for rehabilitation measures." And the reason that I think about this a lot with my work in Galapagos is that I have the great privilege of working with two researchers that have either worked or have worked and lived in Galapagos since 1970. And when I started going down there and would see a scene like this, blue-footed boobies are diving from the sky, tuna and Sierra mackerel are herding groups of fish into a tight ball that the boobies are diving on, the pelicans are coming in, the penguins are joining. And I would turn to them and I would say, this is the coolest thing I have ever seen. And they would agree. They would say, yeah, but this feeding frenzy only lasted 10 minutes and it had less than 100 individuals participating. 50 years ago, a feeding frenzy like this could have lasted from dawn to dusk and had hundreds of individuals participating. And so it's in moments like that that I can see how much that baseline has already shifted, how much we've already lost in Galapagos, and how much we still stand to lose. And in those moments, I'm really grateful to be part of this study with generations of scientists that can really illustrate what a wild, thriving Galapagos used to look like. And it also really inspires me thinking about the future. 30 years from now, 40 years from now, if I'm lucky enough to be on a boat in Galapagos teaching the next generation of scientists about this special place, and someone says, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen, I think about what my response will be. Will I have to say, it is, but I wish you could have seen it 30 years ago? Or will I be able to point to the actions of policymakers, of scientists, of educators, and passionate people? Will I be able to point to our actions and know that we've made a difference for these animals, and that we've worked as hard as we could to keep that baseline from shifting? Yeah, that's something that really inspires me in my work and hopefully inspires some food for thought for all of you out there as well. And with that, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in and listening to my presentation, and I'm happy to answer some questions in the Q&A. Thank you. I think I see, yes. Kendra and Dareth have popped in.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Now, we have a few questions in the Q&A, and we forgot to mention at the beginning, but if you do have any questions for Caroline, please do put them in the Q&A section, and we will go through those now. There's some more coming in, I can see. Are you able to see those, or do you want me to read out the questions for you, Caroline?
I can see them. I can read them out if that...
Whatever works best for you.
Sure, I'll start reading some out. I'll just go in order here. Someone writes, amazing. Do you have to recapture the tagged penguin to ID it or get more data, weight, etc.? The answer to that is yes. We do generally have to recapture the penguin to read the tag, and that's just because the tags we put on them are so small. On Magellanic penguins, those flipper tags, we can read with binoculars or from further away, but the Galapagos penguins, the tags are too small, and so to know their identity, we generally have to capture them. And since we do capture them, we are able to get that information about weight and condition. So the next question was, is there any effort to remove invasive predators from Galapagos National Park? The answer to that is also yes. There are amazing organizations working in Galapagos together to remove invasive predators. Island Conservation, Galapagos Conservancy, local organizations across the islands. These have made huge progress in removing goats from the islands. In the year 2000, there was the project called Project Isabella, where they a huge effort to get goats off of Isabella Island. They've also worked to get rats off of some of the smaller islands. And there's also programs within the cities to make sure that all cats and dogs are spayed and neutered so that we don't have feral animals entering the wild from the populated areas. So yeah, I think those efforts are so important. I think people are doing a really great job with that, but certainly more to do. Next question was, do you have any ideas why some constructed nests are more favorable than others? Yes, we haven't run the official analyses yet, but our gut tells us that penguins like breeding in the nests that are the hardest for us to make. It's what we always say to each other. So it seems like the deeper the nest, potentially the cooler it is inside. It gets really hot in Galapagos during the day. Cooler, it may feel more protected from predators. So it seems like depth might be the big one. And of course, the depth, that's for those ones that are excavated out of the lava, as opposed, the ones that we stack, those don't, those are pretty shallow, and they also aren't as cool inside. So I think it's the ones we really have to put some muscle into. Yes. Okay. The next one was, as a native Arizonan, hello, can you expand on how the University of Arizona is involved in oceanic research? Excellent question. I don't have a great answer to that because my actual current position at the University of Arizona is studying bald eagles. So another large predatory fish-eating bird. So I've sort of climbed onto dry land for the eagle work and stay through UW, continue the penguin studies. But I'm sure there is wonderful oceanic research happening in Arizona. I just actually don't really know what it is. These comments. Can you remove the cats from Galapagos? Yes, they are working on that. Cats are difficult because they're very, very smart. It's hard to get them in a trap. It's hard to get them to eat poison if that's what you want them to do. But they are, they do have some ideas, and they are planning on removing them from some of the large islands in the coming years. I think the park has approved plans for that. I'm curious if there was a dip in Galapagos tourism during the pandemic and if it had any impact on the animal populations there. Yes, there was a huge dip in tourism. The islands were completely closed, both in terms of coming in or leaving for, I don't want to give a wrong number, but it was months. It was a long time, and so there was no tourism, and that really hurt the economy there. But I've heard from people anecdotally that the animals were doing well, or had that period of time where they weren't disturbed by tourists. But I haven't seen any sort of papers documenting that. But I have heard anecdotally that it seemed like the wildlife were getting a bit of a breather. The pandemic also coincided with a large La Nina, which is very good for marine animals and less good for land animals. So it's sort of also hard to disentangle kind of those effects. Are there any research projects in Galapagos that accept volunteers? Yes, definitely. I'm trying to think off the top of my head where I would suggest looking, but Galapagos Conservancy, I think sometimes will look for volunteers. There's a conservancy in the UK that I think will take volunteers. Yes, so there are organizations that take volunteers. And I might, if I think of some after this talk, I can shoot an email to Kendra and Dareth, and maybe they can share that with you. What if, or what was the effect of avian influenza on Galapagos? That is a very timely question. Avian influenza basically just got to Galapagos. I think I got the first email, not that I would get the first email, but I first heard about it getting to Galapagos about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So there was a bit of a delay, and it is confirmed there now, which is very worrying. I imagine, yeah, I hopefully it does not have a huge impact. It seems like, as far as the penguins go, penguins in general seem so far to be less dramatically hit than some other seabird species. So we're hopeful that for the Galapagos penguins, they either, because they don't nest in dense colonies, hopefully the spread isn't very rapid, and that the effects are not so great. But yeah, that's something that we're really watching in real time for all of the animals in Galapagos. Maybe, and then another comment, maybe you could convert the shallow unwanted den sites into traps for cats. That would be very cool. I will leave that to the predator experts, but yeah, I mean, if the penguins aren't using them, basically, if the penguins aren't using them, it seems like the marine iguanas are moving in and just pooping all over our beautiful nests. And so if they could be used for something else, great, but I'm not the expert on that.
Wow, well, thank you so very much. I don't see any new questions popping in, and I know this is the Cetacean Society, but aren't you glad you joined this and heard all about Galapagos penguins? Fascinating, fascinating lecture, Caroline. So thank you so very much. And if you'd like to view it again, it will be up on our YouTube page within a week or so. And check out the Galapagos. I know I traveled there last December and just made it to San Cristobal, so I didn't get to see flamingos or penguins, but did a 360 tour of the island, and it was like being in a National Geographic novel or movie, or it's just insane, the amount of wildlife there. It's amazing, and they do a lot to protect. You've got to sign waivers and pay a fee to enter the park, and even in the airport they had mats where you're stepping in water, to make sure that you're not bringing anything in. And so I was super impressed with all they're doing to preserve everything that they can there. So thumbs up for the Galapagos. So thank you all again for joining us. And then November 16th, it's Beluga Night. So in conjunction with ACSLA, because I went to Anchorage, and so did the president of the LA chapter. And so we've roped in more speakers so you could share your knowledge. So hopefully we'll see you all in November. So thank you for joining us, and please be sure to follow us and put in your email so you can get notifications of all the great things we're doing. Okay, thank you, everyone.